I woke up to my phone ringing, slightly confused, as I had just begun my 2-week vacation from work. I picked up the phone from my nightstand, barely able to keep my eyes open, and noticed that it was my grandfather calling. I knew it had to be important since it wasn't a habit of his to call me this early. "Hello?" I answered the phone with a hoarse voice. "Michael, I'm sorry for waking you up, but I received something important in the mail and I'm gonna need a favor from you. Could you drop by my house later today?" He replied with a seriousness that was rather atypical for him. "Yeah, sure, but what's this about?" "I'd rather not talk about it on the phone. I'll just wait for you to drop by. Is it all right?" He spoke on the same tone. "If you say so. I'll be there in an hour or so." "Good. I'll be waiting for you. See you later." "I'll be there. Bye." I hung up the phone and crashed back into bed for a few moments, thinking about the conversation. It was short, but I knew something was out of the ordinary, as the serious tone of my grandfather could only indicate that there was something truly important happening. It was the first time I felt that something had activated within myself. For a few good years I had succumbed into a depression of sorts, which only enabled me to do what was strictly necessary at work, only to go home and spend the rest of the day walking between the bed, the kitchen, and the counter where I kept my whiskey. I could not refuse my grandfather, though, as he was the one who raised me by himself. His wife had died a long time before I was born in a weird nuclear accident in the Soviet Union back in 1988, and both of my parents died in a car accident when I was only 1 year old, making him the only family I had. He had lost his son in a car accident not a very long time after the explosion at the power plant he had worked on, and had to go through the entire process of escaping the Soviet Union in order to give me a better future. Despite all this, he went above and beyond when it came to raising me, and all by himself he made me feel as if there was nothing missing from my life. Finding out that he needed help was like a long overdue freezing cold shower. I jumped out of my bed, made myself a cup of coffee to properly wake up, but otherwise didn't waste much time. As soon as I finished my coffee, I got dressed in the first clothes I could find, left the house, and jumped in my car. A 15-minute drive later, I was in front of his porch. I walked towards his door and rang the doorbell, happy to be able to see him, as I hadn't visited him in at least a month. A few seconds later, he opened the door and welcomed me with his typical bright smile. "Damn, you're fast," he said and laughed. "Come in, I have a lot to tell you," he continued, pointing towards the inside of the house. I followed him inside and took a seat on his sofa, while he sat on an armchair on my right side, holding some pieces of paper in his hand. "So, what's going on?" I asked and smiled. "You do remember the story of Orlovgrad, right?" he asked, this time without the smile. "I do," I replied, toning down my enthusiasm. "Orlovgrad." I did not expect him to bring it up. It was a story he had only told me once, but it was something I could never forget. Orlovgrad was the name of a city in the Soviet Union, a secret city built in the early 80s, which hosted a weapons manufacturing complex and an experimental nuclear power plant. Only scientists, essential personnel, and factory workers lived there under a very strict regime. The city, and subsequently its inhabitants, had to behave as if it did not exist. The weapons produced in the city were rumored to be much more potent and lethal than anything ever made up until that point, and also kept secret. In the year 1988, one of the nuclear reactors of the plant exploded just outside the city, wiping out most of Orlovgrad and almost its entire population. This also caused the weaponry development project to be virtually wiped out, which was a major setback to the USSR. My grandfather, along with his wife, worked in the city, as he was, according to his own words, one of the lesser engineers in one of the facilities. At the moment of the explosion, though, he was in a delegation of sorts, along with some of his colleagues. Son, my father, was away in some sort of summer camp organized for students at the time. My grandmother, however, was in the city in the moment the explosion took place and died in the process. After the experience with Chernobyl from 1986, the Soviets dealt with the accident swiftly, without really alerting the Western countries. Since the city was so well disguised that most of it couldn't be seen even in satellite photos, the explosion seemed just like another typical Soviet nuclear test to everyone else. The world only found out about what happened a few years later after the Soviet Union collapsed. The ruins of the city were in the middle of a huge exclusion zone in the post-Soviet Republic of Severovaya. You see, a long time ago, at least 15 years ago, I filed an application of sorts that I sent to the Severovian government. It was a request to return to the ruins of the city, to recover a few things, if they're still there, and get one more glimpse at what was my own once. They have some program that allows you to do that, but there's a very long waiting time, my grandfather explained. I'm assuming you received an answer, I asked, rather confused. I vaguely remembered him sending some documents over, but I never gave it much thought. Yes, since I used to be well connected back in the day, they accepted my request, which was unexpected even with my background. They didn't let too many people in. As a matter of fact, I think this could be the first accepted request in 2 or 3 years. Let me guess, you really want me to go all the way to Severovaya? It's not gonna be an easy trip, I replied skeptically. I knew he kept most of his energy despite his age, but I was worried that such a trip wasn't completely safe for him. Actually, I was hoping you'd ask me that. I phoned an old friend of mine. He still lives in Severovaya and used to work in its government before he retired. He said it could be arranged that you make the trip instead of me. If you want, that is, he replied, looking straight into my eyes. I was blocked at first. The proposal came as a complete surprise to me and couldn't be further from what I imagined when my grandfather called me to ask for a favor. Part of me was rather skeptical about the whole idea, but something inside me was almost screaming at that point. I had been stuck in the same routine for too long, and it seemed that I had the perfect opportunity to change that. Look, if you don't want to, I won't blame you for it. I understand you're in a tough spot right now, but I also thought a little background change for a few days couldn't hurt, he continued, before I could say anything. You know what? I think you're right. I do need to breathe some fresh air. Fill me in, I replied, suppressing any skeptical thoughts. I wanted an opportunity to take a leap of faith, and that was it. I'm glad you took it so well. Let me fix some coffee for the both of us, and I'll tell you everything you need to know, he said, leaving for the kitchen. He returned from the kitchen a few minutes later with the coffee and began briefing me. I was supposed to go in there by plane and be met by an official at the airport. I found out that Severovaya had some sort of small government agency that would organize the trips inside the exclusion zone. I found out I'd be accompanied by an officer from that agency to ensure the safety of the ordeal. My grandfather gave me a few documents I'd have to give the contact waiting me at the airport. A plane ticket for 3 days later and an envelope with a note inside that had some addresses on it, probably the ones of his old home and office. I didn't pay much attention to them, as I found out the agent that would come with me was gonna guide me in the right direction. After we caught up on what each of us had been up to, my grandfather gave me a final rundown of the details, and I was getting ready to leave the house. He wanted me to retrieve some personal objects from where he used to live and some documents from his former office. I found it highly unlikely to find such things in a place that had been abandoned for decades, but I refused to protest, as I felt indebted to him to, for the very least, try and fulfill his wish. After all, he was 87, and I liked the idea of helping him be at peace with his past. One more thing. Before you leave, Orlovgrad, it's gained some reputation among certain people. They say there's a rather weird ambience to that place. Just be careful, Mikhail. He spoke in a grave voice, looking me into the eyes. I will. It's only a couple of days. I'll be back before you know it, I said, trying to reassure him. We said our goodbyes and I headed back home. As the hours passed, there were more and more questions popping into my head. I felt that there was something off about my grandfather regarding the trip that I was going to make for him. I saw the worried look in his eyes when I left, and I couldn't understand what he meant about Orlovgrad's reputation. He just wasn't the kind of man who would say anything he wasn't completely sure and honest about. He also called me Mikhail at the end, which he would only do when there was something of utmost importance, as I had been named Michael to better integrate in the US. I turned on my computer, hoping to find some information about Orlovgrad, but all I could find was a long description of the accident that happened there, the way it was covered up by the Soviets, and a few blurred pictures of decaying ruins. I kept wondering whether my rash decision to make the trip was for the best, but at the same time I knew he wouldn't have asked for my help without a valid reason. I couldn't wrap my head around what he was expecting me to find in the place he sent me to, but after hours of torturing myself with a river of unanswered questions, I realized there was only one way to find out. Besides, what could have been wrong in taking a small risk and getting out of the bubble I had built for myself over the course of time? Perhaps he sensed that I was not going through the best of times and that I needed to get out and take some steps in the open world. I decided to just let everything play one moment at a time and take things as they come. I stopped giving the ordeal too much thought for a while, and the time until I was scheduled to leave flew by. I woke up early in the morning in the day of the departure and headed to the airport. I went through the whole routine, and soon enough I was on a flight to the Severovian capital. After a long flight, with a layover somewhere in Europe, I found myself in an almost empty terminal late at night with an excruciating jet lag that made even the concrete floor make like a good place to sleep. Soon enough, though, I was approached by a man in a uniform. "Are you Mikhail Kolobkov?" he asked me with a strong Russian accent. "Yes," I replied, too tired to correct him. "Come, there is car waiting for you to take you to hotel." I followed him to the exit and to the parking lot until he pointed towards a black car in the distance. The driver that had been waiting for us left the car, put my luggage in the trunk, and opened the backseat door, and we both entered the vehicle. The ride was completely silent, and I used the opportunity to take a glance at the Severovian capital through the car window. The city was rather dark, and our car was among the only ones in the street, completing the eerie atmosphere. I watched as we went by hundreds of faint yellow streetlights until the car suddenly came to a stop, which startled me. "This is your hotel. Just walk into reception, say your name, they know you're coming. Driver will be here tomorrow morning at 10. He'll take you to Major Volodin, who will accompany you into Orlovgrad. Don't forget to take your luggage with you." The officer spoke almost mechanically and pointed towards the door. I left the car, opened the trunk, and took my trawler. I stopped for a moment to explore the surroundings. The hotel was huge in comparison to the surrounding structures, looking more like an imposing governmental building. I reluctantly entered through the front door, only to find myself in a luxurious, brightly lit atrium. I lost myself in the richly decorated walls until I was suddenly brought back to reality by a young receptionist who approached me. "Good evening, Mr. Kolobkov, am I right?" A young receptionist asked me with a bright smile. "Yes, that's me," I replied half-heartedly. I felt as if even speaking was a great effort, due to the jet lag and tiredness. "Great. Here's the key to your room. It's on the 7th floor. The elevators are that way." She spoke with the same enthusiasm, pointing towards the back end of the atrium. "Don't you have to verify anything?" I asked, confused by the fast reception. "Oh, don't worry. Major Volodin just called. He told me you'd arrive." "I hope you have a good night," she replied and started walking back to the reception desk. I thanked the girl and walked towards the elevator, barely able to stay on my feet. I went directly to my room, opened the door, threw my suitcase on the ground, and took out some pajamas. I then set an alarm for the following day and jumped directly into the bed without even bothering to see the rest of the room or even lock the door. I probably fell asleep before my head even hit the pillow, as the jet lag was beyond everything I had ever felt in terms of tiredness. I barely woke up to the next morning's alarm, but I decided to take a cold shower as there was a long day ahead. I put a few things I had taken out back into my suitcase and prepared to return to the atrium. Ironically, just as I was about to leave, I noticed how luxurious the room actually was. I was disappointed to have neglected the view from my balcony, as most of the city could be seen from just outside my room. Time was, however, not in my favor, so I rushed to the atrium, left my luggage in a corner, and went to the restaurant for a quick breakfast. I took a few random pieces of food from the buffet, which I ate in a hurry. I couldn't help but think about the difference that setting my alarm for 30 minutes earlier would have made. I finished my breakfast, retrieved my luggage, and left through the main entrance. The first thing I spotted was the same car that had brought me the previous day and the driver who was standing outside the vehicle waiting for me. He grabbed my luggage and put it in the trunk while I entered the car, and we left immediately after. The ride was as silent as the previous one, and the man dropped me in front of a small building, which I assumed to be the office of the agency that dealt with cases like mine. I was instructed to enter and go to the first floor, where I would find Major Volodin's office. I followed the instructions until I found a door that had a small plate embedded to it with the wording Major Kirill Volodin. I knocked, and a hoarse voice invited me from the inside. I entered and found a tall, rather slim man in a uniform. He seemed to be in his late 50s, and his facial expression was eerily neutral, confirming the stereotypical Russian coldness. "Good morning. I am Major Kirill Volodin," he said, and we shook hands. "It's a pleasure to meet you," I replied, unknowing what I was supposed to say. "Sorry to be so direct, but I think we should leave at once. I will explain how the trip will proceed on the way. There is a 20-minute drive to the city train station, where we will take a train to Orlovgrad." He headed towards the door, and I followed suit. He started walking down the hallways and down the stairs at an alert pace, without even bothering to lock his office. The car that had brought me there was still in front of the building, and Volodin gestured towards the driver that we were ready to go. After a short drive, the car dropped us in front of the city's main train station, which was a typical monument of Soviet brutalism. I followed the major inside the building and noticed that the train station seemed relatively busy as opposed to the rest of the city. We walked past many platforms until we reached the very last one, which didn't even have a number assigned to it, and was in a much worse state of disrepair compared to the other ones. Eerily, it was the only platform that had nobody waiting. "Our train will be here in a few minutes," Volodin told me after checking his watch.